All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar entitled FIFRA and the Endangered Species Act, Finding a Balance Between Agricultural Efficiency, Environmental Sustainability, and Regulatory Stability. I'm Chris Boomsma, CEO here at the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, also known as CAST, and it's my privilege today to start this event before I hand it over to our CAST liaison for the paper and also the presenters. Before we get into the paper itself, just a note for those who are attending who maybe haven't heard of our organization before. I just want to give you a few quick facts about CAST. We are a 501c3 membership-supported nonprofit organization formed in 1972 as a result of a 1970 National Academy of Sciences report. We are both nonpartisan and apolitical and pride ourselves on being unbiased. We do have membership composed of societies, universities, libraries, nonprofits, companies, and over 500 individuals from many states and countries. And in 2022, we celebrated our 50th anniversary. Our mission is to convene and coordinate networks of experts, as you will see today with today's webinar, to assemble, interpret, and communicate credible, unbiased, science-based information to policymakers, the media, the private sector, and the public. The vision of our organization is a world where decision-making related to agriculture, food, and natural resources is based on credible information developed through reason, science, and consensus building. I wanted to take a moment right now to acknowledge the many volunteers that make our work possible. We have 65 board members across 3 different boards, many different task force members, authors, reviewers, and many other volunteers that support our organization and make what you see today and throughout the year possible. So thank you to many individuals who contribute to the CAST organization. And now I would like to hand it over to Dr. Tony Burd, comes from Syngenta, who has served as CAST liaison for this paper, and who is going to share a little bit about himself, introduce the authors, and then lead the question and answer period. So Tony, take it away. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yep. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. And Chris did a great job of introducing CAST and the background, and I serve as the CAST representative for Syngenta. I'm on the plant work group. So we have monthly calls with regards to new ideas. So this started about a year ago in understanding a lot of the important work that EPA has been doing to basically come together with the FIFRA process and the ESA process. And, you know, when I originally brought this up within CAST, everyone agreed that this would be a timely and a good paper to basically produce. So immediately reached out to Bernalyn and Dr. Culpepper to have that discussion. And what went from one paper quickly turned into a series of 6 papers. So Stanley, you know, please don't yell at me, but, you know, I assured Stanley that this wouldn't take much time at all. And what went from, as I said, 1 paper to 6 papers quickly ballooned as we tried to fit all of ESA into 1 paper, which was just not possible. So this will be the first of a series of papers that CAST will release, and trying to basically understand how we can, as the title says, how we can come together between agricultural efficiency, environmental sustainability, and regulatory stability. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I will introduce the authors for the first paper, which are Bernalyn McGaughey from Compliance Services. And Bernalyn has years, decades actually, of experience working with ESA. As we all know, this was started back in the 70s, and we've probably had issues with FIFRA and ESA since late 70s, 80s, and been trying to find a solution for pesticide applications since that time. And then we drew in also Dr. Stanley Culpepper, and Stanley is actually a weed scientist extension professor at University of Georgia, the 2-time defending national champs. There you go, Stanley. I got that plug in for you. And so I appreciate them both being here. So with that said, I'm actually going to turn it over to Bernalyn to start the first presentation, and we'll come back for questions at the end. Bernalyn, turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Tony. Appreciate the introduction. As Tony said, there's quite a bit of history just to cover on ESA and FIFRA and what has gone over time, and that's what this paper is about. Next slide, please. But I don't want you to be frightened by the first slide. Don't hang up here. We are not going to go over every minuscule part of what happened since 1972. Coincidentally, the same time that CAST is celebrating their 50th anniversary. So we have a number of years here. What's very interesting, next slide, is that the struggle between ESA and FIFRA as two different environmental acts has been going on really since there's been a lot of attention in the pesticide area on ecotoxicology and the effects on wildlife. Back in 1972, DDT ushered that focus with a cancellation, its wildlife impacts. But what was really interesting is that at that time, industry was actually ahead of that cancellation. Many of the uses of DDT had already been canceled, with the first beginning in 1958. So there is here sort of a industry recognition, regulatory action. Regulations are always behind what's happening on the ground just because it takes time to pass the regulations. So I think what we'll see as we go through these history slides is first a realization that even though we might be hearing agencies and other entities saying EPA has not consulted on endangered species, the fact is that they've been trying to consult on endangered species since the Endangered Species Act was passed. Next slide. Only 7 years after EPA was established and 4 years after the act itself for endangered species protection was enacted, the Office of Pesticide Programs made their first consultation request. That was before there was a mandate that all federal agencies must consult as we know it today. There was an issue of a biological opinion completing the process within 9 months of that action. Slide, please. So what happened during that period, however, was that the process was slow. It was hard to implement. It's a national action when, in fact, the ESA is written for local actions. So for 10 to 12 years, when consultation was being tried, it was not successful. It's not that it wasn't tried. At the end of that period, there was a memorandum of understanding that was embodied in a review document by EPA about how they would evaluate endangered species to comply with the Endangered Species Act. That was adopted, but the backlog grew. The program faltered, so much so that in 1988, Section 1010, a new section of the ESA, was written with themes to educate the agricultural producers, include them in the development of ESA use restrictions on pesticides, and minimize restrictions impacts on producers. The section itself has largely been abandoned, but any of you who might be involved in this process might recognize those 3 points as still part of what is being attempted today. Next, please. Section 1010 required agency reports to Congress, as did some of the recent things that we've seen in the last 5 years. These were reports to identify how they were going to approach the problem, how they would protect endangered species, and how they would implement the outcome of consultation. Because implementation in this process has always been what has ground the process to a halt. Next slide. Then, as we move from 1992 to 2005, I can call this, I think, the era of litigation, because there were a number of attempts, beginning with the Wyoming toad and then a Wyoming toad protection program that tried to implement FIFRA ESA consultation in the way it was meant to be implemented. But it was very slow. Litigation followed after litigation after litigation. To try to relieve the litigation cycle, the counterpart regulations were signed. Those were regulations about how, in short, EPA could stand in for the Fish and Wildlife and NOAA Fisheries Services, the agencies who do the biological opinions, and EPA could make the decisions as long as those service agencies agreed with the procedure they were using. So those were installed. ESPP, the Endangered Species Protection Program, was also reinstalled. That was the first program that began county bulletins. Actually, that began back in 1988 and then was reinstalled by the counterpart regulations in 2005. Next. The counterpart regulations, however, were litigated themselves and vacated partially in 2006. As a part of the litigation series, the first biological opinions were issued by the Marine Fisheries Services on salmon, and they were litigated, and that went on for about 4 years. To attempt to resolve, again, the failing consultation process, the litigation proliferation, the National Academy of Sciences was called in to try to explain what should be done to meet these two acts and to smooth the process. They did attempt to resolve that by science. However, it still didn't address process, and that's where all of the litigation had occurred. To try to resolve process, we've seen a great deal of activity now in the last 10 years, between 2013 and today, to bring about methods, bring about a new bulletin system, revise methods. Everything now is moving very, very quickly. And we left 2022 with an updated interim method that has been the vision, essentially, for what's going to happen to smooth out this consultation process in the future. Next slide. So with that updated method, we are seeing two things. We see a path forward, but we also see that there's a historical pattern. Slide, please. And that is that at the end of each one of these attempts to accomplish consultation, there's been a stall. The agencies, the parties involved try to regroup. How can we do this better? The revised program's launched. They try to tackle it. Struggles happen at the implementation stage, and it stalls. That cycle has happened many times since 1972, where I started that historical review. I skipped a lot of steps and all the details that were in the background of those slides, but it's important to realize that there have been many, many tries in several different ways to make this work. Next slide. So what we're seeing is that we're now faced with finding a way out of this loop, or again, regrouping into a new policy, a revised approach, and repeating the cycle. Next slide. As this timeline moves on, another factor that's come into play through litigation was what was referred to as the megasuit. This was a litigation in that series that I mentioned that covered many pesticides. In the beginning, there were over, well, I don't even remember, but there were some agreements along the way that reduced the number. But the final stipulated agreement to that lawsuit was a surprise to a lot of us, because discussions on a settlement are not public, and they're announced when the stipulation is reached. And in this case, the stipulation agreement included writing in programs that EPA had already begun to work on when they came up with the interim method. However, timing-wise, it came out when industry and others were responding to the herbicide strategy, which is a draft strategy that I'll be talking about more later. So it caused some confusion, but I think we're beginning to get past that surprise and move on to how do we implement the commitments the EPA has made that are now part of a stipulation that have deadlines and promises attached to them. Next slide. The commitments in the settlement are to complete organophosphate consultations, which, as I mentioned several slides ago, were those salmon biops. It was just on salmon then, but now we are dealing with all species. To complete rodenticide consultations, and to develop mitigation strategies for pesticide groups, and expand what EPA has called the vulnerable species pilot, pesticide pilot program. Next slide. So these strategies each describe how a group of pesticides is going to be handled. Back in the 70s, this was called a cluster approach. It was done by crop in that case, but here it's being tried with the type of pesticide in use: herbicide strategy, an insecticide strategy, a rodenticide strategy, and ultimately a fungicide strategy. And separately, the vulnerable species program. Next slide. So the mood of the courts and the agencies in the industry have been reaching their frustration level with litigation and the continued cycle that's been going on. Slide, please. Of regroup, relaunch, retackle, restruggle, and stall. Slide, please. So I think we are all in the mood to make this work. And that's one of the things that this paper and the subsequent issue papers are all about. How do we make this work? What are some of the elements that need to work? And where are some of the problems being faced in the process, coming up, inhibiting progress, keeping us from doing things better, more efficiently, or more protective of species, as well as good crop production. Next slide. I'd like to just dwell a little bit here on each strategy, not so much to go over the details. These slides will be available to you later, but to look at the deadlines and look at the time we have to think about how all of this is going to be developed as the strategies are played out. In the case of herbicides, the goals for completion are spring of 2024. And this has to do with the herbicides that were actually in the litigation that came about that resulted in the settlement. So the commitment here is to complete those consultations as an herbicide strategy. But once they do that, then EPA is to consider incorporating the aspects of their strategy and mitigation measures into a bigger program. So we have a sequential process here. It's important to look at how it's going over time. It has not played out yet. And input and comment is very important because EPA wants to learn. The agencies want to work together. What can all of us do to try to make that happen? Next slide. The same is true for the rodenticide strategy. Rodenticides themselves have been under litigation for years when it comes to endangered species issues. They were one of the first products to have county bulletins. Some of those were almost statewide, and the litigation has repeated over and over throughout time. But in 2024, EPA expects to complete the consultations or their evaluation, excuse me, and then it moves on to consultation. And again, a goal of this strategy is to develop mitigation measures that will relieve potential jeopardy for any species affected or potentially affected by rodenticide use. Next slide. Other strategies in the agreement are the insecticide strategy. Here the timeline plays out to 2027, and its pattern is very much like the herbicide strategy of looking at the products that were in the lawsuit and then considering how that might be translated to operations over the agency as they go through consultation processes in general. Next slide. The fungicide strategy is the last in the series. It's not as well described. It also doesn't have a specific deadline. The parties are to get together again and confer on how they address fungicides and attempt to agree on a date for their final strategy. Next slide. I haven't said too much about the vulnerable species pilot program. EPA actually produced an update to that just last week. They have developed a list of species that they believe are most vulnerable to pesticide use and proposed general protection areas for them and general protection measures. General feedback on that in the comment process was that it needs some work, maybe a step in the right direction, but definitely is not mature. There were two separate efforts. One of them was an internal federal pilot. The second one is this more visible vulnerable species pilot. And EPA has provided the updates that they were to provide, and they expect to keep doing that. Then, with the species already identified, more might be added. Again, this process is playing out over the next few months, and we expect to see how it might expand over the next year into September 2024. Next slide. There's one more piece to the settlement agreement, and that is compensatory mitigation. This is also called offsets. It's something that's done under ESA when they believe that they have protected all the species, but there may be some lingering effects. Therefore, there should be, or must be, depending on the consultation, some kind of offset to that potential effect that couldn't otherwise be mitigated, minimized, or avoided. Offsets can include things that growers are already doing, measures intended to provide resources or habitat or enhancement, preservation of environment. They can also include things that an outside party could do, such as a zoo raising species for propagation. There's no particular program now. This is not something that has been done in this space before. It's not something that has been nationally implemented in this way in a program that could be copied by FIFRA, because all of the other programs are so different. So CLA interveners were in the stipulated case that I've been talking about, are going to organize a workshop for that. And there was a prior workshop in 2021. It'll be similar to that, and it'll be in the next about 2 years. Next slide. But I'm not sure we've really answered the question, can it work? As of today, there's no county in the United States that does not have a listed species. So every county is potentially affected if they have pesticide use. Next slide. The current method we have and the current methods that are emerging are not mature operationally. We realize that. And offspring products of these methods are moving targets. So that's where we are today. Next slide. We're not going to get out of this repeating cycle, however, if we don't try to make it work, rather than just saying why it won't, or repeating that cycle again, as has been done for so many years. Next slide. The hardest thing about all of this is the complexity. And I think we need to look at it from both viewpoints. Slide, please. The first viewpoint is what happens at the National Pesticide Registration Action. That is evaluated by the agencies on a national level, both the services and EPA under FIFRA, services under ESA, and it's informed by a limited amount of information that's related to registrant research, science review, a cost-benefit analysis, docketed public responses, status of the species reports that are generated by the services, and their biological opinion, and then the terms that they issue for that biological opinion that refer back to how the product can be used. That information is all at a certain level, as the black line in that diagram shows. And it might indicate to them that there's a hazard. But as you move down into the field, next slide, down to where we see the pesticide application on a given field, there are many, many other things that come into play. State and federal actions, private and NGO actions, limiting site conditions, then all of the state programs, conservation programs, economic demands, operational demands, environmental limitations, and federal programs operated in the state feed into that. All these little spokes are different programs that I've there under where it says informed by under HJ. I've listed a few just to show the complexity. So as we see all those spokes entering into this use pattern, training pattern, the things that go on in the field, the person that's standing in the field has a much different view and a much different evaluation process for actually using, applying, and making a decision about the use of any given product he chooses. So, next slide. The difficult thing is, how do you get from that national view to the field view in an efficient way? Our subsequent papers will explore this in a sort of what I've called a land between views, to examine how we might move from that national action to a local use action in a consultation in a way that protects species and allows robust agricultural production. We need to answer that question, and we hope that these papers will help to do that. Thank you.
So thanks, Bernalyn, for that presentation. It was a great overview. And I remind everyone that if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A chat, and we will try to, we have plenty of time to answer questions. So if you have any questions, please put that in the Q&A chat. In the meantime, Bernalyn, there is a question. Basically, it's asking, let me read this here. So why has this been so difficult in the pesticide industry, and have we learned anything from other industries on what could potentially work?
That's a very good question. I think it's a good overview question. It's difficult in the pesticide industry because it's one of the few places where the action takes place at a specific site based on parameters within the label and a national registration action that decides how that label is worded. The difficulty is, unlike a highway system that has specific standards by how it can be built around something, or a hydrologic project that would affect a certain area, this could be anywhere to EPA when they're looking down from headquarters, anywhere, anything. There's no limiting factors. That's one of the difficulties. The second one is the label and the consultation process takes place at the registration level. And essentially that is a process that involves FIFRA review, data submission by the applicant or the registrant, and then consultation by the services. There's one other factor there that's probably the biggest factor that is not included in that process, and that's the pesticide user. There we're dealing with use on private land, largely, public lands in some cases, variable in many ways that cannot be each individually evaluated. So we have a process on the FIFRA level of looking at a worst case analysis to put the parentheses around how that pesticide will be used. But in the biological opinion process, they want to know when it's used in Georgia, for example, next to this salamander on cotton, what's going to happen to the salamander? Those two questions are very difficult to bring together in a national process. So you combine two acts, two different kinds of levels, the grower to the headquarters registration action, with the need to understand what's happening locally, and it becomes that complicated. And unlike, unfortunately, any other process.
Great, thank you. We have some other questions, comments popping in. A couple comments just about, yes, the slides will be available. And then could you please share a link to the paper? And I believe that will be shared as well too. Megan can confirm that. So another question here, maybe a comment. It says, part of the problem with the batch process is the amount of time we have to comment, 60 days in most cases. It's very difficult to pull information sufficient to address a complex set of materials, circumstances, etc. So I don't know, Bernalyn, any comment or Stanley on that?
I'll make a comment and then invite Stanley to do so as well. First of all, yes, it is a limiting factor. It has become the only conduit, however, for responding to these draft documents, with the addition of statements by EPAs that they will continue to accept comment even after the comment period. So in this case, the comment period is very important, and we need to get our thoughts to the extent we can. But if there are other important points to be made, the EPA has indicated that they will continue to accept comments, but they wouldn't go through the docket, they'd go through EPA. Stanley, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree completely, but I would actually say we're pretty blessed to have the opportunity to provide comments, and they don't make these decisions without giving us an opportunity. So I think that's wonderful. Where I struggle is when we identify the need for science, right? I think the whole decision process should be based on sound science, but when we develop or understand a hole in that science, we don't have time to generate the data and through the proper processes. So to me, the comment period, I wish it was longer, there's no doubt about it, but the science that we need to generate that we learn through this process takes years. And that's really what I find as a limiting factor, because we could absolutely change the game if we can make these decisions based on sound science.
Yeah, thanks, Stanley. And there's sort of a follow-up question here, Stanley, to maybe some of the points you were just making. It says, and I'll kind of toss this to you, is there any bridge between the assessments that are being done on paper and actual species impacts in the field?
So I would say, at least with our project and the program that we're running here in Georgia, that's exactly what we're trying to do. But you can imagine the time requirement, just mapping the 2 salamanders that Bernalyn talked about, just mapping those species, understanding truly exactly where their habitat is at, where our agricultural fields are at, how they potentially overlap, and then how we mitigate herbicide use to protect those salamanders. We're talking years, right? So again, it is all accessible. We can accomplish it all. It's the time frame that we're put under when we don't respect science that's generated in 1 or 2 months, right? I need to be able to repeat it over time. I need to have colleagues replicate what I've done. So it's that limitation on science, which is the most important component of making the decision. But the answer is we are trying very aggressively, especially on the mapping techniques, but also on the mitigation techniques to take that data and make it accessible for our regulators. And a lot of that's available, especially with mitigations already in the literature. So working that out and providing that information, I give the EPA and their willingness to accept good sound science is absolutely phenomenal, and it's been that way throughout my career. We just have to generate the science that they can use to make decisions.
I would add, Stanley, that when we get back into the regulatory field, there is in the Endangered Species Act a provision for what's called a status review of the species and 5-year updates of those reviews. And in this point-specific process the ESA was designed to deal with, they would measure progress there of the species. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? To make that bridge between assessments and actual impacts in the field. However, when you translate that to FIFRA and a national action, it doesn't translate well. So that bridge is also not crossable at this point, but it should be. As we go forward, we want to know that there are improvements being made rather than assume that they're not. So, and that's also part of the issues we have now, is that at the national level, the Office of Pesticide Programs does not have the information to see, for example, how many USDA conservation programs have been put in place, or where they are and how they've impacted and improved habitat for species. So those are all other pieces of that diagram that I showed at the end that come into play. And the bridge, unfortunately, is not there yet at this time.
Great, thank you for that. There's another sort of a similar question. It says, it seems that EFED is interested in a simple and efficient approach instead of addressing the field level complexity. Any thoughts on how to change that mindset?
What do you say to that, Tony?
I say it's a very complicated process, and it is an absolute balance between EFED and EPA trying to get through a multitude of AI submissions and AIs, but while making sure that you apply appropriate mitigations on the field. So, I mean, again, it goes back to Stanley, and I'm glad that Stanley in Georgia has been involved in this. And I've kind of joked with others that, you know, we need 49 other Stanley Culpeppers in every other state to basically work with the local folks so that they can understand what's going on at a local level in each state. You know, and again, I think EFED is doing their best job to basically get protections, you know, appropriate protections for species, and to try and get out of this backlog of litigation. And you know, they're in a tough spot, but yeah, I'll let you or Stanley add anything to that.
I agree. I think another factor there is one of unfortunate timing, because the agency has been very hit by retirement, losing a lot of talent that they've had. Then COVID came along and interrupted their hiring process, so they're behind in that. They have a lot to do with fewer people, and so they're looking for ways to shortcut that. And unfortunately, on the surface, that means that less science is being applied and more assumptions on a broad level that unfortunately also move this farther away from being a highly specific decision that will work at the local level. So we've got drivers there that are taking us away from our goal rather than moving us toward it.
Hey, I'll add one different perspective. I think the way to change the mindset is to put them in the middle of the field with your growers, right? So whether it's EFED, whether it's BEAD, it doesn't matter. If you have the opportunity to place the individuals that are placing regulations on that are influencing our sustainability, if they actually know who we are and how hard we work to remain sustainable, not only on the farm, but environmentally sustainable. I will argue agriculturalists are the true environmentalists on this planet. There's no doubt. And I personally have seen just changes in relationships, because we all know decisions ultimately are based on relationships and respect, right? So really having the opportunity for a lot of, especially these young people like Bernalyn was talking about, that maybe don't understand what we do, to have the opportunity for them to learn what we do and how we do it and how much we cherish the land and cherish the environment and cherish the wildlife. That has a tremendous influence, especially building relationships and decision making. So to me, I think that's something, and many of us do that, but that is something that is absolutely priceless.
Great. Stanley, here's probably another question for you, and it's not an easy one. I'm not sure you can give an answer to it, but what is a reasonable number of mitigation measures that growers establish?
Yeah, so I'm a weed scientist and I work in about 45 different crops, right? So I work from every vegetable and tomato and all the way to cotton and grain. So, you know, my ability to implement mitigation measures in cotton are far greater than my ability to implement mitigation measures, say, in tomato production on plasticulture, right? So I don't think there's one scenario that we could say, hey, we need this many mitigation measures. I think we go back to the science, and we need the science that helps us understand the potential movement of that product out of a given production system, right? And you know, we know some of the herbicides and herbicide strategy are requiring up to 9 points, right? So I think that's influenced mightily by where you're at, and I think the EPA is doing a really respectable job of trying to organize that. But I don't think it's one given number, because the way we utilize the tools, the way the system influences how long the tools might stay in the field, or the potential movement of those tools off the field would influence the mitigation measures. So I think, again, we're going to have to make those decisions based on science, and we can do it. We can absolutely do it. We just need the time to do it. And if we do it right, we'll do it in a way that the farmer appreciates and respects, because again, no farmer wants any pesticide to move anywhere from other than where they apply it, right? It's their land, it's their family on the land. So we have a lot of opportunities. We just need time to generate the science. But I think it's going to vary by production system as well as the chemistry. Obviously, the chemistry will influence at least the erosion runoffs significantly, right?
So this, Stanley, this is actually a follow-up to your comment. I'm going to read, this is a long question comment, so I'm going to read the whole thing. The argument by Dr. Culpepper is that we can resolve the issues raised by the new EPA ESA policies by more sound science. But what if the whole concern about endangered species and pesticide exposure was itself based on a false premise? Thus, why would you think sound science can resolve a false premise? I noted that the history of where we are now did not focus on the early 2000 lawsuits regarding the listed Pacific Northwest salmon species and the lawsuits quickly generated thereafter. That is where the false premise of pesticides effects on salmon started the ball rolling. Earlier history with DDT and toxaphene notwithstanding. Thus, when you say sound science is needed for resolution, what are you really asking for given thousands of listed species?
Yeah, so with false premise, at least in my opinion, in my experience in 24 years, research and science will define that, right? I'll simplify it. Product X comes in and maybe the owner of the product says it works on 32 species. Well, science will determine whether or not it works on 32 species, right? Science, maybe someone comes in and says this potential product could be dangerous in this potential environment. If you generate the science, you either prove that true or false. Right. And then if it is true, then you develop mitigation measures. So it's certainly not an easy process, and we all understand that. But again, I think research, repeatable research over time, if you look at each of the categories, right? If you look at the mapping of the species, if we conduct a proper research and we know exactly where those species are, that helps us protect them. If you know exactly where the farm fields are, and we know where those farm fields overlap with potential species, we can develop mitigation measures that we develop through science that we know work. There's no need to develop a mitigation measure that doesn't work. And then we can also work on the model, right? Pesticide use rate is critical, as well as species sensitivity is critical when you think about endpoint toxicity, right? Science can help us get the right numbers that go in with the use rate that should go in the model. Science, through the use of surrogate species, can develop the sensitivity. So when you start taking it apart into 6 or 7 bullet parts and you do the science, at least I believe, we can find a solution. And in many situations, maybe we don't need to do a thing, but we need the science to define, hey, what you're already doing is absolutely acceptable practices.
And Tony, if I can address that just briefly. I think that's okay. Here's where the rubber meets the road. The science meets regulation, and the regulators have to take action. And I think what we're seeing with the current interactions on the new methods is EPA and other agencies attempting to establish a process that relieves the decision from being assumed to present risk by building in extremely conservative assessment processes, going back to the earlier question about changing EFED's mind. It's an attempt, I believe, on the regulatory front to accommodate time. The unfortunate thing is that you're, in the meantime, using that regulatory approach, you're greatly potentially impacting some local growers who we don't know where the species is in relation to them. We don't know what the sensitivity is in relation to how the species will behave. And to go to Alan's point, we don't even know there's a problem. So putting all that together, the time then that you're talking about, Stanley, for research comes between that conservative decision and when the science shows it's too conservative. What do we do in between that? What do we do for the 10 to 12 years it takes to generate that science? Do we let growers be impacted?
So I think that's really interesting. And Tony and I were together 2 weeks ago in DC. And one of the challenges that I pose is, why do we put the burden on mom and pop, right? I'm from a bicentennial family farm. When a regulatory burden goes on a pesticide, that goes on my dad. Why are we not putting the burden on ourselves, right? As a scientist, as a regulator, as a registrant, why don't we put the burden initially on ourselves to get the science right, so we don't put the burden on them? So that's exactly the process that I personally think needs to be changed. We go overly conservative. We place all the burden on mom and pop on the family farm who are providing the food, feed, and fiber for the world, national security. We're putting everything on them. We have to change the process, and we have to change it where we put the burden on us to get it right before we implement regulations and restrictions. And just like what you're saying, a lot of the potential concerns maybe are not concerns. You know, I was given a situation where we were concerned about protecting the salamander species on 951,000 acres. Well, we now know we're talking about 3,500 or less. That's where science can be used to identify an overly conservative, unreasonable regulatory action, right? Why can't we work together? Everybody on this call, why can't we work together to get it right based on the science before we challenge the sustainability of our farms? And I'll remind everybody, go look at how many farms we're losing every single year. Go look at how much land we're losing every single year. We have got to protect our family farms. If you protect the family farm, you protect the wildlife, because we provide the habitat for the wildlife.
Great, thank you. Have a lot of other questions in here, so this one kind of as a follow-up, Stanley, is there a group of scientists coordinating on the needed aspects of this? Example, species locations, mitigation measurements, modeling, etc., maybe at a regional scope?
So my answer is I'm very excited. A lot of things are going on, and I don't want to overspeak my commitments, right? But if you read what Bernalyn talked about, an update on the vulnerable species, they're talking about a new approach. They're evaluating the procedures to improve mapping of the species. We've got another team that's going to include hopefully a scientist from all 50 states on farm field mapping. I'll quote spurless pixels, right? So that's really exciting. I'm hoping that our regulators, Fish and Wildlife, EPA, USDA, and our registrants, we can all come together. We can identify which mitigation measures we have plenty of science on and which we need more science on. How cool would that be if you guys and the EPA said, we need more data on the use of a cover crop? You know, we got tons of data on that, but here's an example. Okay, we go generate the data. So the teams are ready. The scientists want to help. We just need guidance on what to do. But I do say, at least with the mapping components, we are, in my opinion, on the move. Now, it could stop tomorrow. I'm not in control of it. But it is on the move. The scientists want to help the farms. They want to help every one of you do that. We just have to get organized. And I think we're doing that, at least with the Weed Science Society of America.
I would add to that, Tony. Since 1996, there has been an industry task force called the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force that has assembled data on species, on crops, on the kind of mapping that Stanley's talked about. Much of that actually has appeared in docket comments and in responses to consultations that have taken place. The malathion, for example, a biological opinion was informed by that data. So the data are there. The problem is that when those data are incorporated into the consultation process, it takes a long time to absorb and synthesize them. That's not to say it can't be done. It is being done. But I think recognizing that those data are assembled and available and working harder with the registrant and stakeholder community to adopt those data into the process is as important as generating any further data to inform the process.
And Tony, I'll just add the other side of it is, you know, it makes every kind of sense to make decisions based on sound science ahead of time. You know, when that just can't happen, and I've done it most of my career, a herbicide is removed from the market, a herbicide is given a regulation, then I have to come back around, right? I have to go generate the science. And just like I think you said, the EPA is very willing once you get the science, then we fix the problem. Right. My issue with the herbicide that's restricted for the salamander, I'm planning on fixing the problem in the very near future because we generated the science. But it would sure be great if we could solve the problem before we put the burden on the farmer versus putting the burden on the farmer and then scientists have to come together to try to solve the problem. Right. We will do that. Right. We're not going to abandon our farmers. Right. If there's something that comes out that puts us in that situation, we're going to generate the science and we're going to work with our regulatory partners to get it right. But man, it sure looks like we got the cart and the horse in the wrong order.
Yep. So this change in directions a little bit, it's kind of focused on state lead agencies. There's two questions that are similar. Says federal policy is often too broad to be of much use at the state or local level. Can the EPA provide state agencies such as departments of ag, land grant universities, and natural resource conservation districts more influence on how to implement federal guidelines within their states? And a similar question, are state lead agencies educated, prepared for enforcing these new provisions? What resources might they need?
I'd like to address that, Tony, if I may.
Sure.
I think that is a very, very important dynamic to focus on in thinking through this process, because it could be that there is the answer. If EPA were to work with the services to inform, equip, and provide a template for the states to manage things within their own borders, for extension to advise and train in their own counties, what an army of people we'd be implementing for this process. And information would begin to flow both ways. But right now, within the FIFRA ESA process, those two are totally disconnected.
You know, I'll just say, whoever wrote that, I'm not sure who wrote it, I agree with you 100%. And we're going to find out, at least in the state of Georgia, right? So the pesticide training in Georgia is not the same as the pesticide training in Michigan. It's not the same as it is in California, right? It doesn't make any sense whatever, even with pesticide use, right? So we need to have some ability to organize, whether it's a training, whether it's mitigation measures, right? A mitigation measure I implement for cotton in Georgia is not the same as cotton even on our family farm in North Carolina. So we need this flexibility, and we do have some creative ways, right? We got state labels and things like that, but maybe this will be an opportunity for our regulating partners to foster this relationship more. I'm blessed with a wonderful Department of Agriculture, and I would love the opportunity to work with our Department of Agriculture and the EPA to implement stuff in our state that actually has a positive influence, right? You can focus on endangered species as much as you want, but with me, it's about pesticide stewardship, right? We need these tools in our toolbox. We as users need to do it right. And to do it right, we need the right information, right education, and the right science to support those decisions. And we have to communicate that, right? So I think we need flexibility there, and maybe this will foster a positive with that outcome.
Great. We have time for a couple more here. I'll just this one may be a loaded question, Bernalyn, but what is the likelihood that EPA's ecological risk assessments have not provided adequate protection for endangered species for the past 50 years?
I say there's very little likelihood that we haven't actually been protecting species, because the conservation built into the methods that FIFRA is employing back in the 80s, added under that memorandum of understanding that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, a safety factor above where they would make a decision for species protection in general. So we always, in the assessments that have been made in the past, there was an additional conservatism built in specifically for endangered species. Were endangered species assessments done? No, but there was another conservatism layer put on the assessment process meant to protect them. So it's my opinion, my personal opinion, that we have been working hard to protect species ever since the Endangered Species Act was passed, and probably before then, at the time when DDT was, most uses were canceled before it came to the attention of the regulators that the product should be canceled entirely. So there are a lot of things going on there. I think that we've become more recognized of how our own impact affects the world around us. We're also beginning to see how deterring activities such as agriculture may in itself be an impact on species, especially when the land gets covered with development or other types of uses than agriculture, or goes fallow and becomes filled with endangered species, and then filled with invasive species. For most species that are listed as plants, particularly, invasive species are the very first stressor. And it's pesticides we use to control those things. So many aspects to the cube of things we're looking at here.
So we probably have time for one more. This is actually just a follow-up from Dr. Felsot. Says BMPs for managing pesticide translocation have been studied for the last 5 decades. What more do we need to learn to manage pesticides? Isn't the problem getting growers to adopt the practices we already know will likely work?
So I'll go. I think that's a very dynamic question, and I agree with you 100%. And that's, again, when I say we need to put the burden on ourselves. So that's my job, to connect a BMP that's been studied very well, understand how it influences a herbicide program. I'm a herbicide guy, right? Herbicide program that my farmers are implementing, and help them understand the values of doing that, right? And that's part of the pesticide stewardship training that I do a lot of, and a lot of my colleagues do a lot of, right? So we need to connect the dots of some of these BMPs, and there's some states that really have some really good ones. I'll mention the Florida one because I'm familiar with that. But that's something that we can do in the states that at least have a strong extension program. And what this situation is doing is that is actually forcing us to connect the dots to try to improve the mitigation regulations that come out. So again, I actually agree with you 100%, but it's people like me that need to take the role in taking that BMP that's been studied for 30 years on fertilizer, figure out how that works on the pesticides that I need to use, and then help my growers implement that. Because again, I personally, born on a family farm a long time ago, I've never met anybody in agriculture that wants a pesticide to go anywhere other than exactly where they put it, right? So it doesn't make sense. So if you give the farmer the science, it improves the environment, it improves their production, it improves all of the above, then they're going to be there. But you got to have the science and the ability to communicate how to do that with your growers. And if you do that, then you get adoption, right? We've reduced pesticide drift in the state of Georgia over 80% since we created our Using Pesticides Wisely pesticide stewardship program. That's not because we're great. That's because the farmers want the information to put the product on target, right? So that's a responsibility I think is very important, and people like myself need to challenge ourselves and implement that.
Great. So I think we just have a few minutes left. We'll probably cut it off here. I'm going to turn it over to Chris. There is just one last question. I'll quickly answer. It says, how does EPA, industry, and academia get NGO groups to be more involved in the proposed solutions? And I will say that, we have been working, whether it's in industry or even with EPA, have been working with NGO groups. Even Center for Biological Diversity has provided some great comments on herbicide and vulnerable species pilot, for help in refining those areas that actually need protection. So, kudos to some of these groups that are actually doing this to help move this process forward. And we'll continue to work with those groups actually moving forward on a lot of other species. So with that said, Chris, I will turn it over to you, and I thank everyone for the questions and answers.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Bernalyn. Thank you, Stanley. Thanks, everybody, for submitting a lot of great questions. Sorry we couldn't get through them all, but what we do typically is gather all those questions and answer them separately. There were questions about what will be made available after the presentation. You will have access to the recording, slides, and the paper is available, and that should be posted, as I saw it, at least in the chat feature right now. So if you click on the link, you should have access to this first of 6 essays. Speaking of the essays, just very briefly here before we wrap up for the day, you see on your screen at this time the dates of the remaining 5 webinars. We're going to continue going through the FIFRA ESA topic here. They go from December to March. Please sign up for all of them so you get a full educational experience, point 1. And point 2, we will hopefully, we do intend actually, to roll out a final summary paper and a larger presentation and panel discussion and networking event at the CropLife America conference in Arlington in April. So for the CLA RISE conference, we intended to be there and convene experts in this space and hopefully get folks connected and give one final educational push in this arena. So with that, I want to once again thank you, all the presenters. Thank you, Tony, for moderating today as well. And we look forward to having everyone who's on the webinar today join us again. If you want to reach us at CAST, please note on your screen at this time our website, phone number, and general email address. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram. So with that, thank you again, everyone. I wish you a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.